Hi, I'm Elissa Gershwitz, Editor-in-Chief of the Hornbook Inc. I'm so happy to be talking to Sabaa Tahir, winner of the 2020 Boston Globe Hornbook, pause, start over, 2022. Hi, I'm Elissa Gershwitz, Editor-in-Chief of the Hornbook Inc. I'm so happy to be talking to Sabaa Tahir, winner of the 2022 Boston Globe Hornbook Award for Fiction and Poetry, for her young adult novel, All My Rage. All My Rage is a New York Times bestseller and was recently announced on the National Book Award longlist for young people's literature. Sabaa is the author of the New York Times bestselling series Ember in the Ashes, and according to her author bio, she likes thunderous indie rock, garish socks, and all things nerd. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Elissa. It's lovely to be here.
We'd like to start out with a reading from All My Rage.
Okay, I am ready. So this reading is chapter 12, and it's from the character of Nur. I like opening the store on Sundays. 6 a.m. is too late for the night revelers, too early for everyone else. It's freezing inside because Chachu is too cheap to run the heater for the 5 hours the store is closed. I move quickly so my hands don't go numb. Shades opened, fluorescent lights on, register unlocked, ice machine filled. Candy and sodas and groceries restocked. I am myself, but I am not myself, like I'm watching someone else from far away. Auntie Misbah died little more than a week ago. Shock has faded into numbness, but grief is an animal I know. It's retreated for now, but it'll be back. Chuck D raps in my ears, making the work go faster. By the time the suns turn the desert outside a bluish gold, I'm warm. The ancient furnace blasts. I get behind the counter and break out my laptop. The UPenn interview, which I rescheduled after canceling it last week, is at 11:30 a.m., less than 6 hours from now. I glance over the prep questions. What is the current project you are working on unrelated to your proposed field of study? Surviving senior year? Trying to fall out of love with my ex-best friend? Mourning the woman who was the closest thing I had to a mom? My English paper, a 15-page monster due at the end of the year, will have to do. Though I can't talk about the paper without writing some of it. Mrs. Michaels wants us to analyze a poem. I picked Elizabeth Bishop's One Art because I like the first sentence. Well, sort of. Mostly I picked it because it's short. But it's also weird. It's about misplacing stuff like keys and houses. How the hell do you misplace a house? I'm reading the poem for the 10th time when the bell over the door dings. I think it's Auntie Misbah for a second. Before the fight, she came in every Sunday morning, chai in hand, ready to watch Dilan de Sode and agree over Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan's music. Verdict, I love him, she called him the Wailer. It's Uncle Tawfiq, and it takes me a second to translate the mumble. Salam, Nur Beta. I pause Public Enemy and glance at the clock, 7 a.m. He's starting early. He finds eggs, milk, bread. When he walks past the wines and bourbons, I relax until something catches his eye and he slows down. Come on, keep walking, Uncle. He stops to add a bottle of Old Crow to his basket. I almost don't see it. He's so fast. Like, if he grabs it quick, maybe he didn't really grab it? He piles everything on the counter, hiding the liquor in the middle. I did the same thing a few weeks ago when I bought foundation at CVS. I guess I was hoping if I buried what I was ashamed of, no one would see it right under their nose. The screen blinks when I slide his credit card. Authorizing. Sorry, Uncle, I say, it's slow. I busy myself by bagging everything up. Outside, a gust of sand scrapes against the glass door. Uncle Tawfiq taps his fingers against the counters, then his pockets. The credit card machine beeps. Declined flashes across the screen. The groceries are $8, the alcohol another 11. I don't even want to sell him alcohol. Every time he drinks, life gets a little harder for Salahuddin. But shame is hard too, especially when you're already broken. I imagine Uncle walking out without the liquor, heading to Ronnie D's and his card getting declined there too, getting desperate, stealing the liquor. Is there a problem? Uncle Tawfiq asks, with the card? No problem, I say. Chachu does inventory on Sunday nights, and he doesn't pay attention to much other than the liquor. I hate lying, I'm so bad at it. But I can text him after I leave, tell him that I spilled a bottle of Old Crow while I was cleaning. Uncle Tawfiq mutters Islam and leaves. I watch him until he disappears behind the low-rent apartments next door. There was always something sad about him, even before he started drinking so much. As Salahuddin might say, he's seen some shit. I wonder what he's seen. Less than 5 hours until my interview, but my concentration is broken. I stare at One Art, read it out loud even though it makes me feel stupid. As I'm finally making sense of it, the front doorbell chimes again. This time, my stomach flutters. It's Salahuddin, idiotically clad only in a t-shirt, jeans, and Chuck Taylors with cracks at the toe, despite the fact that it is 18 degrees outside. His eyes are red, shadowed like they've been all week. I guess he's not sleeping either. I didn't know brown people could turn blue. I reached for my coat, but it would fit one of his arms, so I throw him a shawl I've got stuffed in my backpack instead. You looking for your dad? Nah, Salahuddin drapes the shawl over me. I know I'm used to visit you on Sundays. Thought you might want company. I pull off my headphones where Holler If You Hear Me is blasting. I have Tupac for company. God, what is wrong with me? I'm glad you're here, I add quickly. We haven't talked much since the funeral. He only came back to school on Friday. Salahuddin cocks his head. He tries to smile. I want to tell him that he doesn't have to, that if he never wants to smile again, I get it, because I was 6 when my parents died, and I still feel that ache.
Oh, there is so much there. And I hope that for people who have not yet read the book, I hope that really gives you a taste and interest to read it, because it's just such a wonderful book, and that's such a great selection to get you into it. How, for people who have not yet read the book, how do you describe it?
So I describe All My Rage as a contemporary novel about 2 former best friends growing up in the Mojave Desert of California. Sal, or Salahuddin, is trying to save his family's business and reckon with his family history. And Noor is trying to escape this small town that they live in, and her uncle, who is her guardian, and who doesn't want her to go to college. And she does want to go to college. So it's a story about, I always describe it as a story about family, true love, grief, music, and friendships that save your life.
It is all of that. So your background is more science fiction fantasy writing.
Yes.
What inspired this very realistic fiction?
Well, when I was younger and I didn't know I could be a writer yet, I always actually wrote realistic fiction. And I wrote about my experiences. I wrote about what was happening in my life. I remember taking a creative nonfiction class as like an undergrad and being like, oh, you can write about this stuff, right? So actually, the basis for All My Rage was conceived in the early 2000s, and it was inspired by this motel where I grew up. When I was still in college, my dad had a stroke, and as a result, my parents sold the motel. And I was away from home when this happened, so I didn't get like the closure that I might have needed about this place that was such a formative part of my life. So I started writing about it, and over the course of time, that sort of resolved into a story about the tenants at this motel in a desert. And it was, fiction, and it was, sort of, some of it was fantastical, some wasn't. And I tried so many different ways of approaching it, but I couldn't get the story to really work. It felt very incomplete. It felt like I was not really telling the story I wanted to tell. I think it was because I didn't have the wisdom or the distance. And I kept thinking like, okay, when I'm like 40, I'll tell this story. And lo and behold, like that's how long it took, So it took about a decade, more than a decade, after I first started to really figure out, how to tell the story. The book out now, All My Rage as it is, as you see it, that really began to, I'd always been working on it, but the actual story as it is now began to take shape in 2017. And that was after someone I knew died of a drug overdose. And everything I witnessed around that incident, the shame and the grief and the confusion it had an impact on me. And it also really made me think about how alcoholism and drug abuse and just things that we are ashamed of, how they are viewed in different communities. And in this case, in a Muslim Pakistani community. So I wanted to, I had explored a narrative thread that dealt with addiction in sort of the original form of the book. And, when I started connecting what happened, with the story and sort of threading all these things together, I started bringing in trauma and grief and rage and hope. And I kind of was able to suss out the contours of the story. So it really was something that's been going on for years and years and years and years. And it's like, I would try to work on it, I could fail, try to work on it and fail. It's been a long effort to get this story told.
Well, you can definitely feel that these characters are people that we know, but that you know. I mean, every character in this book, the main characters, but everyone from the I don't want to give things away. It's not like a super spoilery book, but there are some parts you don't want to give away. But every character is really more than what they seem on the surface, or more than what you might assume from them or looking from the outside. And it's funny that you were talking about the residents, because there are even some residents that you get to know, and not majorly, but they're there, and it really rounds out what's happening in the book and what's happening in the background. There's so much emotion. I mean, there's so much emotion in this book. It's not a, it's not a total downer by any means, but there's so much heart in it, and so there are tough things that these characters go through. Are you the type of writer who really feels those emotions along with your characters, or can you kind of put a little distance? And because just everything they're going through is really, it's tough. It's really tough stuff.
I maybe in another 20 years I'll be able to put the distance between me and the characters.
Yeah.
But I really have to be in it with them. Sometimes when I know a difficult scene is coming up, it takes me weeks to get into the right headspace. I really do think that's why this book took so long to write. And it's really fascinating because I'll hear from readers who will recognize that, people who haven't read about the story, who haven't, who haven't read any interviews or anything, and who will write and say, I read your book. I really loved it. It must have taken you a long time to write. And I'm like, people get it, right?
Yeah.
So there's examples. There's a scene in All My Rage between Noor and her uncle. And it actually took me years to write that scene. And I think when people read the book, they'll know what scene it is. It stands out. I overwrote it. I underwrote it. I took the whole thing out. I added it back in. I had so many voices telling me, don't include this. Other voices being like, no, you have to include it. And finally actually erased everything I had, and I rewrote the whole scene from scratch, and it had more than a decade of thought behind it. But on a blank page, I was able to just channel in everything I had learned and whatever wisdom I picked up, and put it into one chapter, and it changed very little from that version. It's the emotions are what made this hard to write, right? They're so familiar that I had to sometimes get up and walk away from the book and be like, okay, you need a little space. You need to think, you need to be able to write this story effectively, but not, go down a spiral while you're doing it. So, it was tricky. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and the title, I want to ask you about the title too, because, it's not all my anger or all my sadness or my disappointment. It's rage. So did that, and even that doesn't always mean what you think it's going to mean when you're reading through the story. So did that title stay with you from the beginning? Where did you land on rage as the word there?
So, for the longest time, the book has always been angry. It's always been an angry book. For the longest time, the title of the book was Burn It Down. It being the motel, and also everything these people are feeling and all their frustration, right? But over time, I began to realize that the source of the tension and conflict within the story was actually not a place, but it was the characters and their relationships, and it was how the world had treated them. And so I kept thinking about the word rage and how it was the only word that really accurately affected and described what they were feeling. It's like rage is not an emotion everyone is allowed to feel. And it's really sad that, an emotion as simple as anger which is basic and essential to humanity, that it can't be expressed by specific groups without it being a source of fear. And, Muslims are one of those groups, right? So, if you have a Muslim showing their anger or showing their rage, that can be seen as a threat. That's, like I said, it's sad to me. And I think as a result of that sort of suppression of emotion, a lot of us hold, not just Muslims, but just people in general, women, especially recently, I'd say a lot of us hold so much anger inside, and we can't express it without serious consequences. And so I was trying to reflect that a little bit in the title. All these characters are forced to hold so much of their rage inside, and it's tearing them apart. And the book is in a large part about their journey and dealing with that rage and acknowledging it and figuring out what to do with it, because you can't just have it sitting here for the rest of your life. That's not a way to live. And that's not what these characters want. They're so young, they shouldn't have to sit with it. But what do they do with that feeling? They can't just zap it and disappear. So how do they treat it? How do they interact with it? And how do they eventually sort of make their peace with it? So that's where the title came from.
Along those lines, and this is kind of a spoiler, so I'm not going to really go ask the real question I want to ask, but what about this idea of forgiveness when it comes to the context of this book? Because that's also something that you think is one thing and it is a little bit of something else.
Yeah, so, forgiveness, I think society likes to tell us that when we grant forgiveness, we're holy. And when we ask for it, we're humble, right? But like any other act, I think that forgiveness is what we make of it. So I think that Noor finds it very difficult to forgive, especially when she feels like she's being ordered to forgive somebody else, because forgiveness is granted, right? It's not, you can't like take it from somebody. And Salahuddin, it's like it's very difficult for him to forgive too, but it's also really difficult for him to ask for it, and he tries to earn forgiveness without asking for it directly. And he tries to grant it, but he doesn't have it inside himself. So I think to grant true forgiveness means in some part to release the stronger emotions that are preventing you from forgiving. And in the case of these characters, it is rage. It takes so long for Salahuddin and Noor to even recognize that the knotted up, like difficult feeling inside them is rage, that to then move from that to forgiveness is the journey of the book, right? Is part of their journey that they go through as young people.
Yeah, it really is done in such a deep way. It's not at all what you expect, and it's not what the characters expect. And it's completely, when it is granted, it's completely earned, and when it's not granted, it's also completely fine and justified and understandable.
It's fair, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly, absolutely. Which I think is a sort of a complicated idea in the world, but certainly in literature for young people, it's a really you really complicate that idea in such a wonderful way that I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Because young people are sort of, I think we don't always give them enough credit. We don't give them enough credit for understanding nuance, right? Like they are often just told like, oh, you should forgive. Always? Every time? Is that really fair to ask a young person to do? Should the young people of Flint, Michigan forgive what has happened to them for years and years without having like good water? Like I don't think that should be forgiven, so that is part of this, is like, what is fair? Is it fair to always ask for forgiveness, or are you putting a burden on the person you're asking forgiveness from?
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about your characters' names and the importance of being called what they want to be called in terms of pronunciation, in terms of nicknames, in terms of how what somebody calls a character in the book, what that says about that character and the reaction that they get?
Yeah, so nearly all of the names in my book are, I choose all of them very carefully. Sometimes it's based on meaning, sometimes it's based on sound. But for example, the name Shafiq means compassionate, and he is the character in the book who, one of the few adult characters who displays a lot of compassion for the kids. Khadija, who ends up being an ally in the book to the children, means trustworthy. Even side characters' names, they matter to me. And I think a big part of the reason why they matter so much to me is because of how it felt to have my own name mispronounced for years. So the first person outside of my family who said my name correctly was actually my husband. When I first met him, he said it naturally. Like it wasn't even, I didn't have to, explain it to him. He just said Sabaa, and I'd been called Sabaa my whole life. And so he said Sabaa, and I still remember, like, there's a shift in me when it happened, this little change that made me kind of realize like what it felt to be called by your true name and how good it felt and how validating. And so that is a big part of the story, is, this idea of names. And it's, I tend to touch on names and the importance of them in all of my work. For some reason, it's like a weird little obsession of mine. So.
We've talked a good amount about the two young main characters, but I also want to talk about the third narrative perspective that you introduce, which is the mother and the auntie character.
Mhm.
Why was she's an adult, and she's writing from not exactly now. So why was that an important perspective for you to bring her voice into?
So I think that we, particularly immigrant children, but all children really, we only see our parents as parents, right? We only see them through the lens of our own lives. And it's difficult, and it usually takes until adulthood for us to really see that they were these whole entire people
Mhm.
with a whole entire life before we ever came along. And so part of it was to allow Salahuddin to kind of see that and work through that. Um, and part of it was just to allow us to see the way generations affect each other, the way you can be a really good person and have a really good heart and still make decisions that harm the people who come after. And what impact that can have on those people and on those families. So that was why I included her perspective. And it's interesting because I had a few people tell me they didn't want her perspective in the book.
Hmm.
But I had others, and it was sort of fascinating who wanted the perspective and who didn't. I had others say, like, if you take that out, I will come to your house and like get you. Like, you have to leave her perspective in. So ultimately, I really connected to her perspective. It was also, I'm a parent. I have two children, and I have learned a lot about my parents just from being a parent. And I think many parents of young children can say that, right? So it allowed me kind of a chance to explore that and explore different themes around parenthood and what we leave our children and legacy and that sort of thing.
I have to say, I grabbed a Twitter quote from you that I saw earlier. I think it was this week or earlier in the week, where you said, the absolute best thing about today is that I told my 10-year-old I was nominated for the National Book Award, and he then told me that out of all the kids in his class, he can stuff the most Oreos in his mouth.
Yes, this is true. I was like,
Yes.
so impressive, dude. Good job.
But I wanted to ask, sort of related to that, what has the book's reception been like from children who, maybe not children who are related to you, because our own children are one thing, but what has the reception been like from actual young people?
When I wrote this book, the story felt so specific that I was like, is anyone going to read this? I mean, um, Ember was this very sort of explosive, hooky adventure story. That was my first book, in Ember in the Ashes. But All My Rage is very different. So the response has also been different. All My Rage has found its audience more slowly. The response has been much more emotional, though, if that makes sense. Like, I've had emails and DMs of people not just asking questions, but telling me like what the book meant to them. And this isn't just, Pakistani readers or Muslim readers. I'd say it's actually more readers from all over, from all ages, which is really fascinating to me. It's not just young people. It's also like, I've gotten emails from people in their 70s, from entire book clubs saying like, hey, we read this book and this is what we think, and we just wanted to tell you. And it's really encouraging because it tells me that even though All My Rage has currently, a smaller audience, it will hopefully in time, the people who need it will find this book. So that's also why I appreciate the award so much. So thank you guys, because I think that anything like this always helps a book that maybe is a little bit quieter find the people who need it, especially the young people who need the book.
Well, thank you so much. It really, if anyone who has not yet read it is really in for, an emotional, I don't even know how to describe it. It's not an emotional roller coaster. It just is so beautifully emotional and just everything that you need. And you really get to know these characters so well. And thank you so much for bringing them to us and letting us spend time with them and with you.
Oh, thanks for loving us.
We really are so happy for you and for the book. Thank you very much. It has been great talking to you.
Great talking to you too.